Welcome back to Ancient Dream, where stories come alive in the quietest hours of the night. Get comfortable, pull up your blanket, and let yourself drift into a time when one woman's determination changed the world forever. Tonight, we walk beside Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, whose light still guides us today. The rain was falling steadily on the night of May 12, 1820, in the Italian city of Florence. Inside a grand villa, a wealthy British family awaited the arrival of their second daughter. William and Frances Nightingale had been traveling through Europe, enjoying the culture and beauty of Italy, when their daughter decided to make her entrance into the world. They named her after the city where she was born, Florence, never knowing that this name would one day become synonymous with compassion and care. The Nightingale family was wealthy, very wealthy. They owned estates in England and moved in the highest circles of society. Florence's childhood was one of privilege, filled with fine dresses, elegant parties, and everything a young Victorian lady could want. But there was something different about this little girl. While her older sister Parthenope enjoyed the social gatherings and looked forward to marriage, Florence found herself drawn to something else entirely. Her father, William, was an unusual man for his time. He believed in educating his daughters just as thoroughly as he would have educated sons. So Florence learned Latin, Greek, French, German, Italian, history, philosophy, and mathematics. She devoured books with a hunger that surprised even her tutors. Her mind was sharp, always questioning, always seeking to understand the world around her. But despite all this learning, despite the comfort and luxury, Florence felt an emptiness inside. She would often slip away from the grand parties her mother hosted, finding solace in the quiet corners of their estate. She began visiting the sick and poor who lived in the villages near their home. Something happened to her when she tended to these people. She felt alive, purposeful, complete. When Florence was 16, something extraordinary happened. She was in the garden at Embley Park, their family estate, when she heard what she described as a voice, a calling. She believed God was speaking to her, telling her that she had a mission, a purpose. But what that purpose was remained unclear for years. She only knew that her life was meant for something greater than tea parties and finding a suitable husband. The years passed slowly for Florence. She fell into deep depressions, feeling trapped in a gilded cage. Suitors came and went. One man, Richard Monckton Milnes, pursued her for 7 years. He was educated, kind, and would have given her a comfortable life. But Florence knew that marrying him would mean giving up her dreams. After years of deliberation, she finally said no. Her family was devastated, but Florence felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was 30 years old when she finally broke free. In 1850, she traveled to Germany to visit a hospital run by Protestant deaconesses in Kaiserswerth. It wasn't much, a small institution that trained women to care for the sick. But to Florence, it was paradise. She spent 2 weeks there, absorbing everything like a sponge. When she returned to England, she was more determined than ever. Her family continued to oppose her, but Florence had reached her breaking point. In 1851, she suffered what we might today call a nervous breakdown. She was exhausted from fighting, from trying to please everyone while her own soul withered. It took her 2 more years. But finally, at the age of 33, Florence Nightingale took her first real position. She became the superintendent of a small hospital for sick gentlewomen in London. It was a modest start, but Florence threw herself into the work with fierce energy. She reorganized the entire institution, improved the sanitation, and fought with the hospital's board over every detail. She was exacting, demanding, and absolutely brilliant. The hospital transformed under her care, and people began to notice. Then came 1854, and everything changed. Britain, France, and Turkey went to war against Russia in what became known as the Crimean War. British soldiers were dying, not primarily from battle wounds, but from disease and neglect. The military hospitals were disasters, filthy, overcrowded, and lacking basic supplies. News reports shocked the British public, and something had to be done. Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of War, and an old family friend, wrote to Florence asking if she would lead a group of nurses to the military hospital at Scutari, near Constantinople. Before his letter even arrived, Florence had already written to him volunteering her services. It was as if fate itself was aligning. Florence and her nurses worked 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. She was everywhere at once, directing operations, comforting dying soldiers, writing letters home for men who couldn't hold a pen. She spent her own money, hundreds of pounds, to buy supplies the military failed to provide. She set up kitchens to prepare proper food for the sick. She organized laundry services because men were lying in blood-soaked sheets. But Florence was more than just compassionate. She was analytical, scientific in her approach. She began keeping meticulous records of every death, every disease, every recovery. She noticed patterns that others missed. She realized that more men were dying from infections and disease than from their wounds. The hospital itself was killing them. She fought with military officials, demanding changes. She wanted better ventilation, cleaner water, proper sewage systems. Many dismissed her ideas as the concerns of an overly fussy woman. But Florence had data, statistics that proved her points. She was perhaps the first person to use statistical analysis to drive public health policy. Every night, after the doctors and other nurses had retired, Florence would make her rounds through the wards. Carrying a small lamp, she would walk between the rows of beds, checking on each man, offering comfort, adjusting bandages, simply being present. The soldiers began calling her the lady with the lamp. They wrote home about her, telling their families about the angel who watched over them in the darkness. One soldier wrote, "She would speak to one and nod and smile to as many more, but she could not do it all, you know? We lay there by hundreds, but we could kiss her shadow as it fell and lay our heads on the pillow again content." Another said, "What a comfort it was to see her pass even. She would speak to one and nod and smile to many more, but she could not do it to all, you know? We lay there by hundreds, but we could kiss her shadow as it fell and lay our heads on the pillow again content." Back in England, Florence became a legend. Newspapers published stories about her work. Poems were written in her honor. She became the most famous woman in Britain, a national heroine. But Florence herself cared nothing for fame. She was focused entirely on saving lives and reforming the entire system. By the time the war ended in 1856, the death rate at Scutari had dropped from 42% to just 2%. It was an incredible achievement, though Florence herself knew the deaths could have been lower if her reforms had been implemented sooner. She would carry the weight of those lost lives for the rest of her days. When Florence returned to England in August 1856, she did so quietly, using a false name to avoid the public attention. She had no interest in celebrations or honors. There was too much work to be done. While most people would have rested after such an ordeal, Florence immediately began writing a massive report on the conditions she had witnessed and the reforms that were desperately needed. But the war had taken its toll on her body. Florence had contracted what was probably brucellosis, a bacterial infection, during her time in Crimea. She suffered from chronic pain, fatigue, and frequent fevers. By 1857, she was often bedridden. Many historians believe she also suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. She had seen too much death, too much suffering. Yet even from her bed, Florence continued to work. She wrote constantly, producing reports, letters, and books that would revolutionize healthcare. In 1859, she published Notes on Nursing, a book that became the foundation for modern nursing education. It was practical, detailed, and written in clear language that anyone could understand. The book became a bestseller and is still studied today. Florence had a brilliant mind for organization and reform. She understood that to truly change things, you needed to change the systems themselves. She began working with the government to reform the entire military medical system. She designed hospitals, created training programs, and developed standards for sanitation and patient care. In 1860, she established the Nightingale Training School for nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. This was revolutionary. For the first time, nursing would be taught as a serious profession, requiring skill, knowledge, and dedication. The school attracted young women from respectable families, changing the public perception of nursing forever. Her graduates went on to establish nursing schools around the world, spreading her methods and philosophy. Florence was also deeply concerned with broader public health issues. She studied sanitation in India, where British soldiers were dying at alarming rates from preventable diseases. She wrote reports on workhouse conditions, on childbirth practices, on hospital design. She corresponded with officials across the British Empire, advising on everything from water supply to building ventilation. What made Florence truly remarkable was her use of data. She pioneered the use of statistical graphics, creating what she called coxcombs, circular diagrams that clearly showed mortality rates and their causes. These visual representations made her arguments undeniable. She proved with numbers that cleanliness saved lives, that proper sanitation prevented disease, that good nursing care made all the difference. Despite her chronic illness, Florence lived to be 90 years old. She spent most of her later years working from her bed or a couch, receiving visitors and writing constantly. She never married, never had children, but she mentored countless nurses and reformers. She corresponded with Florence Nightingale with people around the world, from America to Australia, sharing her knowledge and encouraging reform. As she aged, Florence became increasingly reclusive. She suffered from poor eyesight and hearing, making communication difficult, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to write and advise on public health matters well into her 80s. The government sought her counsel on various issues, and she never stopped advocating for the poor and sick. In 1907, at the age of 87, Florence became the first woman to receive the Order of Merit, one of Britain's highest honors. By then, she was largely blind, and her memory was failing. She spent her final years in a quiet confusion, cared for by nurses who had trained in the very methods she had established. Florence Nightingale died peacefully on August 13, 1910, at her home in London. She was 90 years old. The British government offered her a state funeral and burial in Westminster Abbey, the highest honor the nation could bestow. But Florence had left instructions declining such recognition. She wanted a simple burial, and that's what she received. She was laid to rest in the family plot at St. Margaret's Church in East Wellow, Hampshire. Her grave is marked with a simple inscription, just her initials and the dates of her birth and death. But Florence's legacy was anything but simple. She had transformed nursing from a disreputable occupation into a respected profession. She had revolutionized hospital design and sanitation practices. She had proven that statistics could save lives. She had shown the world that women could be leaders in science and medicine. Today, nurses around the world take the Nightingale Pledge when they graduate, promising to uphold the standards she established. May 12th, her birthday, is celebrated as International Nurses Day. Hospitals are designed using principles she developed. Her books are still studied in nursing schools. But perhaps her greatest contribution was something less tangible. Florence Nightingale showed that one person, armed with determination, compassion, and intelligence, could change the world. She proved that caring for others was not weakness, but strength. She demonstrated that reform was possible, that systems could be changed, that progress was within reach if people were willing to fight for it. She lived in an age that told women they were fragile, incapable, meant only for domestic life. But Florence refused to accept those limitations. She educated herself, fought her family and society, and carved out a path that no woman before her had walked. She endured criticism, opposition, and personal suffering, but she never gave up on her mission. What drove her was not a desire for fame or recognition. It was something deeper, a conviction that every life mattered, that suffering could be prevented, that the world could be better. She saw the faces of dying soldiers in that lamplit hospital, and she could not look away. She heard the groans of the sick and wounded, and she could not ignore them. Florence Nightingale's story reminds us that change often begins with one person who refuses to accept the way things are. It starts with someone who sees suffering and decides to do something about it, regardless of the cost. It grows through dedication, through long hours and hard work, through fighting battles that seem impossible to win. Florence Nightingale showed us that compassion is not passive. It requires action, courage, and often sacrifice. She showed us that one person's dedication can ripple out across time and space, touching millions of lives they will never meet. Every patient who receives clean, professional care, every nurse who treats their work as a calling, every hospital designed with patient welfare in mind, they are all part of her legacy. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the world right now, a nurse is walking through a quiet ward, checking on patients, offering comfort in the dark hours of the night. That nurse is carrying forward a light that Florence Nightingale lit more than a century and a half ago. That light has never gone out, and it never will. Tomorrow, you'll wake to a new day, to your own challenges and opportunities. Remember the lady with the lamp. Remember that change is possible, that dedication matters, that one life devoted to helping others can transform the world. Sweet dreams.